Well, a lot of things were announced last year at Dayton, and some of the things didn't ship as quickly as we might have wanted. So what finally did get on the market, and some new performance highs and also some disappointments. So nothing changed from the big picture. In a contest or DX pileup, we still need work the weak guys surrounded by strong signals, and that's what it really comes down to. And I don't go into this in great detail but you need a better receiver on CW in a contest environment or a DX pileup than you do on sideband. And this is fairly simple because the transmitted splatter from the typical transceiver today that has a 100-watt PA running on 13.8 volts is not particularly clean. The cleanest transmitter I ever owned was a Collins 32S3. And unfortunately, the equipment in general, except for some of the Class A stuff, with a caveat, your receiver is not the limit most of the time if you've got a guy 30/9, 3 kcs away, and you're trying to work a guy S3. So the receiver is not the limit there. It's a different situation on CW. So unfortunately, some radios get into production and they've got glitches in them, so I'll be talking about some of that today too. So what shipped since Dayton last year? Well, the Hilberling, which of course had been sort of on display for 5 years, and it actually shipped, but then Hans flew into Denver along with John, and there's some issues came up in the lab, and then I read it in a couple of contests, and it quit shipping. But they're making great progress, but that's been slower than I'm sure they wanted. The TS990, I just got my hands on that in the last, about 6 weeks. And then the Flex 6000, Gerald flew into Denver and was in my lab for a day for about a month ago, and then up to my QTH out in the country, which if you've looked at my call on QRZ, you can see I'm out there in the quiet zone. And Gerald got to hear his radio at something other than downtown Austin. The 3000 shipped, which would be something significantly cheaper than the 5000. And unfortunately, there was some trade-offs there. And then the little KX3, that was kind of a surprise. It's a tiny little radio. You can convince your wife to put it in her purse. So when you go on vacation, you got your radio. And we'll see how that plays. So what's unusual about the new rigs? Well, the Hilberling is probably the last pure analog radio. It does have audio DSP, but it has crystal filters, and it'll probably be the last radio ever designed that way. But it's really got an extremely quiet synthesizer. As you may remember if you heard me talk in the past, phase noise is often the limit on a radio, and it's not the case in the Hilberling. And matter of fact, it's 10 to 25 dB better than the FTDX 5000, depending on the spacing. The 990, of course, is a big step in Kenwood's return to the amateur field with top-of-the-line equipment, but it's 5 times more expensive than the 590. And the 590 is a darn little good radio. I know N2IC runs to them in SO2R, so it's a nice little box. So it's interesting to see the two there. Flex is shipping, I guess maybe half a dozen, I don't know. I got to see it for 2 days, but Gerald is going to ship me one 1st of June, and we'll really get to use it. So we've only had a limited chance to play with that. The synthesizer in the 3000 is a big disappointment. That's really the limitation in that radio. And also the ergonomics were something that was kind of shocking, so I'll cover that in some detail. The KX3 at $1,000 is very low phase noise, which means it's not going to be reciprocal mixing, dynamic range limited, just like the Hilberling, but the KX3 is $1,000, and the Hilberling's $18,000. So it's amazing that they were able to do what they did with that little radio. The QSK, though, in the KX3 was real disappointment. So that was a surprise, because the K3 is excellent in that respect. So were there really any deal changers this year? Well, the Hilberling shipped, and I think there were 42 of them when the one that I have on loan, and found the problems in several areas, and so it sort of stopped shipping at that point. It's at $18,000, it's going to be kind of a niche product, obviously. But you know, the IC 7800 is what up to now? Approaching 13,000, something like that. So we've got some really high-end radios from that price standpoint. It'd be interesting to see if Kenwood decides to come out with a radio in the middle, because we've got now a $1,600 radio that does very well, the 990, but $8,000. I don't know what you do, SO2R, you have two of them for $16,000, I guess. So there's really a big space there. So will they come out with something in the middle? I don't know. On the Flex world, the contesters have really not used it in great numbers. Anyone using a Flex radio of any model currently or recently, raise your hand. Let's see how many people here are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So modest number, and I think this is mostly ergonomic. You've got staying in focus troubles, whether you're trying to log and suddenly you're on some other band, and most of us are so used to knobs that it's just a really different. So that's going to be interesting to see what the new interface does with the Flex 6000 series, because Gerald really wants to crack the contest market and the DX market, but at least certainly the contest market, which he hasn't really done up to now. The Aizu products are interesting. They have Class A for the 5000 and 3000, and of course some of the older like the Mark V. But in the case of the 5000 and the 3000, they do most of their processing instead of in the speech processor, which of course exists, but they do most of it in the ALC. And this pretty much ruins the Class A clean signal, which is a shame, because I was on the air with the 5000, no processing, no ALC. A guy broke into the QSO and said, "I want to comment on your signal." I thought, uh-oh. He said, "I have a P3 and a K3, and you have the cleanest signal I've ever seen on the air." So that was quite a compliment, but if you start hitting the ALC any amount, all that goes away, and you're just like anybody else with a Class B. I don't know that the KX3 will appear to you guys as serious contesters, but I ran it in the W1BB contest this last December 30th. I drove my Alpha 89, 300 watts output with a massive 12 watts of drive, and it worked well. You know, I was in the high power class, which I really wasn't quite up there, but I enjoyed running it, and it was a lot of fun. So let me cover the Hilberling in a little more detail. It covers 160 through 2 meters. Of course, most of our rigs today go up through 6. And that's different. Whether that's significant, I don't know, because that's really a VHF contester guys are in kind of a different world. It has 16-pole filters. That's something that was very rare. I actually sold a 16-pole filter for the R4C decades ago, and I think maybe with the CX11 had 2 8-poles. So, but for the most part, we haven't seen that. Touching on clean signals, what did they do? Originally, they had a 10-watt, a 100-watt, or 200-watt, and a 600-watt version. Well, they scrapped all that. They just have a 600-watt PA. They run a 200 watts. So suddenly, we have a very clean transceiver, and that's really great. But it has major production updates, so anything that shipped really is going to have to be updated. I just put the most recent, or actually Ken and 0QO installed the most recent updates. When I first talked to Hans 5 years ago, I said, your radio with a 500 hertz CW filter as the narrowest bandwidth, that's not going to cut it. And when I used it in the contest last fall, that filter just was too wide, and I was mostly doing S&P. Now maybe if you're running and you want to be able to hear a wider swath, but for me, it wasn't wide enough, it wasn't narrow enough. So I just now beginning to use the radio with the new, they added a 16-pole 250 hertz filter, so finally they have enough selectivity. But of course, it's $18,000 depending on where the yen is. And for a band scope, which I'm pretty much a fan of that. Now, admittedly, if you just run 90% of the time, you probably don't need it. But I'm more of an S&P guy, and particularly on 10, 15 meters, I want to find those signals that are popping up. So it needs a computer, so that's just one more thing it needs. But maybe you could hook a P3 up to it. I would assume you could. So let's talk about the 990. I haven't had it all that long. I just went into HRO and they said pick one out random, and ran it through the lab. What's different about it? It's a what we call down conversion radio, and that's not technically right, because obviously if you're on 160 and the first IF's 9 megahertz, that's not down. But the term meaning it's not a high IF. It's not a first IF at 40, 50, 70 megahertz. It's like the K3. It's got high voltage FETPA. I would hope that more rigs would do that because it's really difficult to develop a really clean PA running it at 13 volts. So this has the 50 volt. That's great. I haven't checked the IMD on transmit, but it doesn't have the ALC overshoot problem that the TS590 has. So they got that fixed. So since they know how to fix it there, it'd be nice if they'd fix it in the 590. For the main receiver, it doesn't have the problems that the 590 has, which isn't a deal killer with most of the bands, but the work bands in 10 and 6 meters on the 590, which is the sub receiver in the 990, it's an up conversion radio. So it wouldn't be your first choice for CW in that respect. But it's price competitive with the other top of the line products from other companies, like it's similar probably to an IC 7700. The thing that was a surprise, and I gave this information to Kenwood and said, do you think there's anything wrong with this sample? And I haven't heard back there was, but the reciprocal mixing dynamic range, in other words, phase noise limitation of the LO, the synthesizer, was 87 dB, which was kind of a surprise because the 590, the one I had, was 88. So they were really virtually identical. But if you test the radio the way that the league tests it, in addition to reciprocal mixing dynamic range, you get a number of over 100, matter of fact, over 110. This other method, I never liked it, but it's a valid way to test a radio. To me, it's more of value if you're trying to, you're in the lab and say, where's my weak point in my radio? And you want to know, is it phase noise, is it intermod, is it whatever the problem might be? So if you want to measure the intermod that's buried in phase noise, then you use a really narrow filter. Now, how many people run a CW contest with a 3 hertz filter? Please raise your hand. So far, no one's ever said they do that. But that's how you test a radio with 2 of the league's measurements with the very narrow filter. It allows you to actually measure the distortion products. But in this case, the distortion product's buried in 24 dB of phase noise. So I don't see what information it gives you of value. But at least if you have both numbers, you can pick whichever one you like. The 6000, admittedly, I said, I've only seen it for 2 days. It's got a fantastic band scope, like most of the Flex. It's got an interesting new graphical user interface. You can have multiple receivers, multiple band scopes, all going on at once if you have enough horsepower. It worked really well with Windows 7 with an i7 processor. It even worked with XP, but you couldn't put the 4th pan adapter up there. It kind of choked at that point. Now, I think that it needs more dedicated buttons. For me, there's probably 5 or 6 knobs on my radio that I use all the time, and of course with anything that's got a mouse and a bunch of places to slide or push down a little drop-down menu or something, I think that might be the thing that would slow down your rate. So it does have a pod if you want, and it has 3 buttons on it, and so obviously the knob tunes the radio, so that was what I liked. But you have the other buttons, which I didn't even get into programming. So the question will be, will Gerald break into the contest market with this product? It certainly is going to perform well from an electrical standpoint, but will the ergonomics be good enough, or can that be developed over time? What I'd like to see would be a box you could plug in the computer, and I'm going to program these 5 buttons. They're going to do whatever I want, or 5 knobs, and I would just forget that it's a SDR radio for the contest, but that hasn't happened yet. It did well. In my QTH, I've got just a T antenna on 160. It's 60 foot high, and it works very well. Broadcast stations from Boulder come in at -3 dBm. Most radios at my QTH need a high-pass filter, and the 6000 did not. So it's working as one would expect. But the surprise to me was that it's got a 13.8 volt PA. And I would have thought, why not put a DC to DC converter if you don't want to supply an internal power supply and run it on 50 volts, but that isn't the case. The 3000 this was a disappointment to me. The ergonomics is probably the worst problem. The band scope is useless. The vertical scale is like a half an inch. So you can't differentiate anything on it. The funniest thing was you could go on to CW and you had a knob on the front for the power output, and you turn the knob and adjusted the power to drive your amplifier to the proper level. Okay, switch over to sideband, it was clipping 100% of the time. Like, what's going on here? So in sideband, you have to go into a menu, and then you have to pick menu, I think it's 117 or something, and then you got to adjust the level, and then you have to hit the menu button to memorize that. So to adjust the power on sideband, you got 4 operations, which is like, why would you program it that way? I think you could fix that in firmware and make an update, but to me that was crazy. The other thing, it's a typical, most radios today, since about, well, ever since the Orion 1 came out, that are DSP radios, they overreact to impulse noise. Now, whether it's electric fence, which I have to deal with, or it's the brake on your tail twister rotor when you quit turning it and the solenoid lets loose, any type of a click, tick, or pop for most radios today, the S meter goes way upscale, particularly on sideband with the wider bandwidth. And that really annoys me. And that was interesting because when I first had the Orion 1, I thought, boy, the band's noisy. I was northwest of Boulder, up in the country, up in the hills, and I thought, well, let's listen on my old, some other radio. I listened my C line and listened to my older Icom, and there weren't any clicks, ticks, or pops that I was noticing, but there was on this DSP radio, and that has become rather typical. All the Yaesu, all the Ten-Tech, and all the Icom that are past a certain date. So that was continued the problem of how to handle the AGC. Elecraft does it right, and Flex does it right. It's interesting. Can be fixed. As I mentioned before, though, the ALC on the 3000, like the 5000, if you look at it on a scope, and I run a scope 100% of the time, it's almost like you took the peaks of the audio and you cut them off with a razor blade. They go up to one point and just flat. And that's what the ALC is doing. The time constant is too fast from my perspective. The KX3, it was a cute little radio, and I used it in the W1BB contest. The QSK has lots of clicks and ticks, which is strange because the K3 doesn't. It doesn't have enough audio output for my little Sony earphones. I like the Sony. They're low distortion. They're low fatigue. They don't weigh much. They fit on my ears very loosely. And so I had to use some powered computer speakers, plugged in the headphone jack, and then my headphones plugged in the powered computer speakers, and then the level was fine. The other surprising thing is during the daytime on 160 in the contest, like Saturday afternoon, I had to run the preamp just to get enough gain. So, but I gave it the numbers to Elecraft, and they said, oh, that's the way it's supposed to be. So, all right. Now, I could only get 300 watts out of the amp, so once they come out with their external amp, if you really do want to run it in a contest and run full power, you're going to need some extra gain there. The numbers, if you look at my website, actually the two top, by the way the table is sorted by close-in dynamic range, in other words, the CW type test, the Hilberling, the KX3 are right at the top. But this isn't the whole story. And don't get crazy about a dB or two here or there. But also, in the case of the KX3, because the way you test a radio for dynamic range, you have 2 signals, and they're either 20 kcs apart or 5 kcs apart or 2 kcs apart. Well, in the case of the KX3, when they're 2 kcs apart, the numbers are over 100, which is great. But because it's a 0 IF radio, it's converting right from RF to audio. The opposite sideband is only rejected by the balance of the system, and you can go in and adjust this, and you adjust the phase and the amplitude. You can get it down to about 70 dB, but that's only at 1.06 kilohertz. I don't know why 1.06, but that's where they tell you to null it. But at 500 hertz or 1.5 kilohertz, it's more like 60. So even though the number is there at the top of the chart, that's not the whole story. So if you do it, say you're working a guy S2, and he's tuned right in, you got a guy on the opposite sideband at the same frequency, he's only going to be down 60 dB or so. So the K3 will do better in that type of situation. But it's still an amazing little product, and it's only $1,000. It does have a synthesizer that wanders around a bit. The phase noise is excellent. But if I'm not into WSJT much or at all, but I understand that in some of them they kind of expect you to be, at least for the short term, stable. And this is going to wander around a bit. That may affect some of these low noise protocols. It does handle the impulse noise perfectly, just like the K3. Elecraft calls it the Sherwood test, because before the K3 shipped, I said, everybody's radio is having trouble with impulse noise. Fix this. And they figured out how to program it. If one pulse comes along, one tick, whether it's your solenoid in your tail twister or at your neighbor's electric fence, that one tick shouldn't tell the AGC, well, kill the gain 25 dB. But that's what most radios do today. So now we're going to get to the nitty-gritty on numbers. I mean, it's kind of a numbers game. Everybody wants the top radio. But up through 1976, when the league tested a radio and I tested a radio, we all had the same concept and pretty much got the same numbers. You'd use a 500 hertz CW filter, and you would adjust the levels so that either whether you're seeing the actual intermod, it would go up 3 dB, or if it was the phase noise, it'd go up 3 dB, and you'd say, okay, that's what we're going to call the limitation of the radio, when it's degraded 3 dB. And I didn't differentiate it particularly except for a little footnote in my chart, and in the QST it would say phase noise limited. But then from 2007 to 2011, that differentiation pretty much went away because they added the measurements with the 3 hertz filter. Now it's a valid test, but the question is, well, how much greater is the phase noise, if it is, which most radios are, than the reciprocal mixing value? And it can be considerable. So we went around and around, and Adam Farson, VA70J, sort of intervened as a third party, and then we came up with a compromise the fall of 2011 that the league would now be publishing reciprocal mixing dynamic range along with their normal dynamic range and blocking dynamic range. So this is the first radio. That was agreement was come to in September of 2011. And so the first new radio that came out that got reviewed with a new technique, additional technique, was the IC9100, which is very similar to the IC7410 if you just want the HF version. This covers 2 meters also. So you can see there, that's right out of QST. The top graph shows reciprocal mixing dynamic range of 77. But if you measure it with the 3 hertz filter or an FFT, whatever they happen to be using right now, it got 87. The blocking was kind of low. I mean, 111 for blocking is not particularly good, but just ignore that. We're really going to talk about what's the difference between the 77 dB and the 87. And a single signal 2 kilohertz away gives the 77 dB answer. 2 signals 2 kilohertz away and 4 kilohertz away, if you measure with 3 hertz filter, gives you an 87 dB number. Take your choice. There's the tabular data, and they showed that at wider spacing, 20 kc, the reciprocal mixing was better than 100. So obviously if the QRM's 20 kcs away, that's not going to cause a problem. And most of the time in a pileup, the QRM's not 20 kcs away, but it could be in CQ Worldwide if it's going to have the bottom 50 kc full of signals. Well, it could happen. So Bob Allison wrote up a very nice sidebar. Go back to your April 2012 QST and read about what the new RMDR is all about. But I won't read this whole thing except the last sentence. If I get close enough, I can actually read it. It says, in many cases, reciprocal mixing dynamic range is the primary limiting factor in receiver performance. And I agree with that. Using a normal bandwidth, 500 hertz filter, or 250 even. That only changes at 3 dB. So here's the numbers for the KX3. And now that was the next one to be tested after the Icom. The next one was actually clear into December. And here, this is amazing. This radio is not phase noise limited at all. At 20 kc, it's 120. At 5, it's 119. And at 2, it's 114. So the phase noise was 16 dB better than the intermod. So this is like the noise is just out of the picture, which is the Hilberling sort of that way, and this and most are more similar, like the K3, the phase noise and the intermod just about the same, and then others are worse. Okay, the 3000 the review came out just recently, and the graphical reciprocal missing dynamics range, the graphic was missing again. It was missing with the with this one, the KX3, even though the tabular data was there. And the same thing for the 3000. Wait a minute, did I get the right one? Yeah, the right one. So again, we have the tabular data at 100 measured with the 3 hertz filter, or we have the 82 value measured with the 500 hertz filter. That's quite a difference, and of course, since the graphic was missing again, it was, unless you read the fine detail, you just saw the 100 dB value. So how do you sort out these numbers? If you're not really a techie nerd sort of like I am, and you look at the reviews or you look at the ads, well, what are you going to say? Everybody wants a 100 dB radio. And you've got a review at 100. You've got the Yaesu ad at 106. Now, I couldn't even duplicate that in the lab. But when I published my data on the 3000, it caused a lot of stir on the reflector because I said it was 82. But then the league measured it at 82 also. So we got the exact same number if you measure it with a 500 hertz filter. But I never could get the 106. So some of the hams are feeling, well, I kind of felt like I got misled. And so you just have to decide, well, you're going to have to read the fine print. But if the numbers that appear in print are 10 or 20 dB or 24 dB, worse than the way the radio probably operates on the air, assuming you're in a CW pileup, then we're kind of comparing apples to oranges. After the league published their information, Rick K2XT was writing the league and talking to Bob Allison and saying, I'm kind of concerned about this because I spent my money and it seems like I didn't really get what I thought I was getting. So he said, well, if you're really serious amateur, you're going to spend a lot of money on antennas, and we've had a lot of talks today about great antennas. And this is true. I mean, I've certainly spent a lot on antennas. So Bob says, well, you're going to buy a great transceiver to go with your rest of your station, and I agree with that. But the second thing he said, I just was stunned. He said, the point is moot with a dipole antenna or a tri-bander, that's what most of us have, there's not enough voltage at the antenna terminals to notice reciprocal mixing or third-order product problems. Now, I don't agree with that. Certainly locals can be stronger than that, and so let's look at what data would not agree with that statement. Particularly 160, we're probably running verticals. We're running full power. Like in my case, the worst is working JAs in the morning at 7 o'clock, and there's a guy banging away calling CQ, and the JAs don't even go to the DX window most of the time. They're just down the lower 20 kilohertz. So I might have a signal that's 50 over 9, just calling, banging away CQ 1 or 2 KCs away from my JA. Field day is a terrible situation. Now, admittedly, that's not, quote, a contest, but a lot of us sort of treat it as that. It's a lot of fun. And it's, as Tim was talking about, how to isolate your signals, you know, this fantastic way to have a vertical and a dipole the right way so you can keep this isolation between the two stations on the same band. So that's where the phase noise has really been a problem, and even sometimes from another band where we can have guys on 20 and guys on 40 and we're bothering each other. Multi-2, or you're the multiplier station and you're having to deal with the other transmitter. You're a de-expedition with a mult station or something. You guys in the East Coast on the low bands, if we've got a dipole on 80 meters at 70 feet, it's mostly a cloud warmer. So we've got a lot of short skip that's going to be very strong. So you can get a lot of strong signals on a dipole. And then the thing that I thought was strange was he said, well, the guy with the stack, he's going to get the big signals, but the guy with the tri-bander won't. It's, like 40 feet. That isn't true. What does a stack do? A stack takes energy that would be in high-angle lobes and brings it down to the low-angle lobes. Well, the tri-bander at 40 feet, he's going to be getting the short skip that's going to be strong, and the guy with the stack is going to get less QRM from short skip stateside than the guy that's got the tri-bander. So that was just a head scratcher to me. So how are you going to choose a transceiver? Well, the numbers can be misleading depending on what you look at. So you need to be real careful what the number means. I mean, it's a numbers game. But we also have to use it on the air. That's been the biggest improvement from my standpoint of trying to answer people's questions since I started building my contest station 7 years ago. I've got 6 towers and 9 monoband Yagis. And is being able to actually borrow a radio, or maybe I own it, but hams are really nice. They'll loan me radios for sometimes 2 or 3 months. And you get to use them on the air and see what really works in a contest. So there's no way my laboratory, anybody's laboratory, can duplicate CQ worldwide with 2 or 3 or 4 signal generators. It just isn't the same thing. So I'm going to cover some other things that I've touched on or discussed in the last 5 years. This is my 6th presentation. Some of you are all new, and you're going to get a smattering of it. So what's important in addition to these issues I've just mentioned today? What I called contest fatigue is caused by poor audio, poor AGC, distortion products. I mean, we have enough QRM that we don't want the radio making it worse. Ergonomics can slow down your operating speed, whether it's taking 4 adjustments to adjust the linear power level. Transmitters are, at best, not getting better, and except for the Class A, in the case of the Yaesu, if you don't run a ALC. You need good speech processing. Almost all speech processing today is done in DSP, and some are better than others. Some radios you can upgrade the firmware with just a USB port or serial port, and others you can't. Is the warranty service handled well and quickly? That's important to me. I don't like fixing radios. So if I can just send it off and get it fixed, great. But then what happens when the radio goes out of production? Are you still going to get parts availability and service? And then what about all the radios today have an LCD display? What happens when that radio is out of production and the LCD goes out and you can't buy an LCD at any price, or maybe it's $500? So this is a concern. I mean, I've got a 1970 whatever R4C and the LCD hadn't gone out yet. Yeah. The bottom line to me is I need to enjoy using the radio. If the radio is not fun, I go use another product. So hopefully after you pick all your things out, at the end of the contest, like I enjoyed it, and I'll look forward to the next contest. So here's some examples from past CTUs on things that I find a problem that don't get mentioned in the magazines or the ads. For instance, the TS590 has an ALC overshoot problem. If you're running a pair of 3500Zs, it doesn't matter at all. You're never going to blow those grids out. They typically take 80, 90, 100 watts to drive a pair of them, so it's no problem. But if you've got a lower drive amplifier, particularly with the ceramic tubes, the triodes or the tetrodes, they may only need 50 watts of drive. The Icom, the Alpha 9500 takes 35 watts of drive. And if you've got an overshoot problem, you can blow a very expensive tube. I was testing the 590, and I started testing it for intermod, but I fed in white noise. Now, this isn't a perfect replacement for speech, but it's kind of a worst-case scenario. When do we have something that might be something like white noise? When we say CQ, we got it, S's. The sibilant sounds are where the high frequencies are, and that's where you have the whitest splatter. Well, I was feeding this white noise into the transceiver, and about every 2 or 3 seconds there was this spike. So I told Adam, VA70J, I said, you've got the radio now, another, one of those, so that same unit, test it. So he used a sound card to make white noise and fed it in. I don't know if you can see it in the picture, but see the spike there just to the left of the red arrow? That's 100 watts. But we set the rig for 50 watts output, but every 3 seconds we got a spike up to 100. And that can, blowing an 8877 wouldn't make my day. 5 kilohertz. Yeah, it was 3 dB down. It was a GR. In my case, it was a GR white noise generator. So 3 dB down to 5. It had a 2.5 kilohertz option also. It didn't make any difference. Yeah. The pink noise. Right. I agree. But I didn't. But my. I agree. Well, it has more highs in it. That's true. It does. Right. But the point is the spike existed in voice. I mean, why did we go look at it with white noise? Because when you'd say, you push the mic button, and you'd say test, and so it wasn't the button on the microphone, and it would have a spike, as in another shot that I would have shown last year, where we had a 100-watt spike, was just saying test. So, you know, obviously my noise test was reasonable because it did the same thing as my voice did. So now we have the 7410 to look at intermod, and why did I say sideband? In the case of a receiver, you didn't need as good a receiver on sideband as you did CW. So here's a 7410 with white noise fed into it, and this is, instead of a 2-tone test, this is like a 1,000-tone test. So you can see the shoulders here. You can see nice square passband, flat on the top, and then at 22 dB down, the intermod starts fading away. And you had to go out 5 kilohertz to get down 60 dB. And this is just sort of your typical PA running on 13.8 volts. I've got pictures of Tentec, Yaesu, all of them. They're all just about the same. That distance, instead of being 5 kcs, is maybe 6 and maybe 4, but they're all similar. So therefore, if you're 3 kcs away from that signal, and this is 5 kcs away from the edge of the signal, not center passband. So you can see if your radio is a 70 dB radio, which most upconversion radios were, you know, like a Pro 3 or something, and the splatter will be in the range of like 40 dB down or 50 dB down. Well, your 70 dB radio on sideband isn't a problem because it's the guy next to you, most likely. Now in CW, it's a different story where we don't have intermod to worry about, but we do have rise time and fall time on the CW signal. So there is as much as a 20 dB difference of the width of the signal depending on the rise time. Now I used an Omni 7 to take this test because it just went into the menu and you just adjusted the knob. So the upper trace, I was just sending DITs at 30 words a minute, and the upper trace is the 3 millisecond rise time, which is as fast as it goes, and the bottom one is the 10 millisecond rise time, which might be a little soft, and that's as slow as it goes. And you see 700 hertz away from that signal, there's a 20 dB difference. So if you want to be a good neighbor and not be cluttering up the band, then you really don't want to set your rig for the fastest rise time it'll adjust for. Of course, some won't be adjustable at all, like the FT1000 series was known for key clicks for years, and probably the rise time was a millisecond or something, so no wonder people complained about that. K0RF's not all that far from me in Colorado. He was even closer when I was in Boulder, and I couldn't get with his 5 kilohertz of him. I mentioned the AGC impulse anomaly, and since 2003's, most radios have the problem. The K3 does not, although you can turn off their programming to let the pulse drive the AGC nuts, and you can see what it does. And the KX3 also works just fine too, and the Flex. You know, a click or a tick shouldn't do as much as it does. Now here's a video representation. I made a recording, and the left channel was the radio that has the problem, and the right channel was the one that does not. Now, on the bottom trace there, you can see that my neighbor's electric fence pulsing there about every 2 seconds, and you can hear it when I play the audio. But look what's happened in the top trace. The pulse goes off, and the audio virtually goes away. Now, this isn't logarithmic, so it doesn't go away entirely, but you can see that the impulses are driving the AGC crazy. So the top one is going to be an Icom Pro 3. 160 meters here at that date, and KV4FZ, and he's certainly a contester you've probably heard of. Listen for the audio level is pretty constant. You can hear the clicks, but there's not, whoops. So the noise is there, but it didn't really cause us any problems. So now this is the exact same time, just on the other channel, of what happens when the AGC is not coping with the pops correctly. That was set on slow. And obviously, if you put it really fast, it will decay quicker. To me, a really fast AGC is tiring because I don't want the noise, whether it's between words on sideband or between words on CW. I don't want the spaces being filled in, but that's just a personal choice. But anyway, it isn't necessary for a radio to do that because the K3 doesn't do that and the KX3 doesn't do it, and then most of the Flexes don't. The other thing in contest fatigue is the audio section of most transceivers is kind of an afterthought. We think we're got to worry about the front end, the filtering, and noise reduction, and all the fancy stuff. But we really need, eventually it's got to come out the speaker, and the amplifier ought to be clean, and we shouldn't have a lot of problems. And really we need to look at a spectrum way beyond just 3 kilohertz. So when I first borrowed a K3, when it first came out, I listened to it for about 30 minutes and said, boy, something's wrong with this radio. The audio sounds awful. And I talked to Elecraft, and they just didn't do anything. And then for the next 6 months, I'd say, what's going on here? So then in August of 2008, I was giving a presentation at YCCC in Boxborough, and so was Flex. I called him up on Monday and said, we're both going to be there, and I'm going to be talking about your terrible audio. Why don't you fix it? So they spent the next 3 days in the lab, and they called me up on Wednesday and said, it's fixed. So they sent me these pictures. Now, this is the picture. I had my own pictures. This was from Flex, and theirs was even worse than my picture because they were testing at about 1.5 watts. And I was only testing it at about 300 milliwatts, which is more typical level. I'm sorry, did I say, okay, this is the K3. I'm sorry saying Flex, I'm glad you pointed that out. Okay, so this was pictures from Elecraft, and that's a 2-tone test. Now, that isn't what it ought to look like. All that garbage out there going clear up to 5 kilohertz, the ear is amazing. The distortion products there are down like, well, what are they, 10, 20, 30, 40 dB, but the ear hears that. I mean, the ear is amazing. You can hear distortion products down 60, 70, 80 dB. So this is the way it was, and it had been this way for 6 months. And so then they said, here it is, it's fixed. Now it's better, obviously better, but it still isn't as clean as I'd like to it. And so when I use a K3, I take the line out and feed it in an external amplifier. So it's a shame that, what do you see when you look at the spec on a radio? It'll say it puts out 2.2 watts at 10% distortion. Now, if you had a hi-fi company who were selling an amplifier rated 100 watts and you said it puts out 100 watts at 10% distortion, do you think you'd sell many amplifiers? So we really need something better than this. Now, the league has improved. A few years ago, I said, this is crazy. And so they're now testing radios at 1 watt. No, 1 volt RMS. And they'll say right there in the review, like maybe it says 0.4% at 1 volt RMS. Now this is good. If they want to keep, if the OEMs want to keep saying it's 2.2 watts at 10% distortion, it's fine. But we really want to know what it is at normal listening levels. But now here is an Icom Pro 3, and there's a single tone, and look how clean it is. And there's a two-tone test on my Pro 3, and it's just got a little bit of distortion, 0.3%. So we can have clean audio, and it shouldn't be an afterthought that we just stick some old chip in there. But the 2% distortion, you can't buy a chip that puts out distortion at 10% just unless you drive into clipping. So why would you rate an amplifier into clipping? That's just crazy. But that's the way it is. It was left over from the Stone Age days, I guess. So what do we have to look at in this last 12 months? We've had radios come out between $1,000 and $18,000. And many of them do well. But it's hard to pick a radio today if we just look at ads or just look at published data, because it's kind of confusing which number do we look at. So many aspects of the radio, whether it's ergonomics, it's contest fatigue, it's dynamic range, it's reciprocal mixing, all these things affect how well we're going to perform in our contesting environment. So at the end of the day, though, we would hope that I enjoy using the radio. I mean, people ask, what should I buy? Well, I don't want to tell you what to buy, but at the end of the day, we should say this was an enjoyable radio to use. And you shouldn't say, well, I'm just going to pick this one. This has the biggest numbers. That's what I'm going to buy, and just make that as a single way to make a decision. That I don't buy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. So K1 Delta Golf, you have some contest results. This is one of those contests that you get the results very quick. He's been adjudicating all afternoon.
And we certainly do love our adjudication. We did run all the logs through the supercomputers at Poisson d'Avril contest headquarters. We disabled the automatic K1DG win algorithm, so it was judged fairly. We had to use the supercomputers because, God, you guys got really bad handwriting, really awful. God. Okay, so we do have winners. We actually had a tie for second, so that meant we had to come up with a third prize, and I only had two. So, would W5WZ and K5GO please come up the front here? Where are you? Yeah, there you are, and you're in the front row. And where's Stan? 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 Oh, you have to be present to win. Sorry, Stan. No. Okay, whoops. Tied for second with 14 QSOs and 12 multipliers for a final score of 168 billion points. A new record. A new record. Well, almost. Congratulations, you've won a WRTC 2014 button and a $50 gift certificate for WRTC merchandise. Congratulations. Stan would have gotten the same thing, but, oh well. Sorry, Stan. At least we're buying his antennas. And first place with a score of 16 QSOs, 12 multipliers, including, I think he got the 7Q7 that was on the band. That was a real rare one this year. For a score of 192 billion points, N9NB, winning a WRTC button and $100 gift certificate from DX Engineering.
Thank you.
Congratulations. Great job. And if you see Stan, rag on him. Thank you. Thank you, Tim.
Good work. So we come to the end. It's hard to believe that about 9 hours ago we started this. It's the fastest 9 hours that you'll ever go through, I think, because 28 sessions just goes by in a heartbeat. But that being said, there are some band plan Icom maps out on the registration table. If you take some of those back to the clubs and so forth, that would be great. Make sure if you go by the Icom booth that you thank Ray Novak for all of his support. We've had a great webcast today. There's been people from all over the world that got to see a little bit of what you guys got to experience firsthand. I don't have a feedback sheet this year, so if you would just email any comments, positive or negative, things we can do differently, things we can do better for next year. Email them directly to me, k3lr@k3lr.com. And during the week, this week, we'll be uploading all of the presentations that you saw here today. Some of the slides have been updated, so you want to go and see that. I'll make an announcement on CQ Contest about the fact that the slides are up when they're up, and also some of the addendum materials. The glossary is already there, the Code of Ethics is already there, and we'll put up some of these antenna model results as well. So parking vouchers. Jerry still has a handful of parking vouchers if you need to get out of the hotel parking today. It's been fun. It's been real. The 7th year was the best ever, best attendance ever here in Dayton. So we look forward to 2014. Have a great contest season, and we hope to see everybody at either the top band dinner or the contest dinner Saturday night, 73, and good luck.
Outstanding. Thank you. Another great year, Tim.